Good evening everyone, thanks for coming to the AGM. And today we're very honoured to have Vicky, also a good friend, and I
help sell at the trade
I help
shows.
sell Vicky's product at the event. Just that, the thing is, why I invited Vicky today for our talk today is because her concept of composting is very different from what you see in the market out there, and it actually enhances the concept of, we all heard of dig a hole, put your garbage in the ground, cover it up, correct? Alright, so but then that has got its problems, and like vermin, and it's very slow and stuff like that. So when I met Vicky many years ago, I don't know how long, a couple of years ago, and I saw what she has done, and it's not just using worms, okay, it's using more than that. And therefore, I'd like her to share with as many people as possible. And take it away, Vicky.
Thanks, Hendrika, thanks. So actually I met Hendrika back at the very first, the big garden fair they had.
Pine Rivers.
Pine Rivers, yeah. That big one they had, yeah. Anyway, So thanks everyone for having me. And as Hendrika said, I'm guessing because you're all gardeners, you already all know about composting. So how many of you have worm farms? A lot of you. I know Hendrika, I get worms from her for customers. And how many of you have the big tumblers on the ground? Oh, sorry, not tumblers, but those big Jedi things on the ground? One, a few of you with those. And how many of you have tumblers? So it's a good, nice mix. So all of those things are great ways to compost in their own right for what they do, but you can't put meat and dairy and citrus and onions and things like that in them. Now, worm farms, you can put some of that stuff in there, but it takes a while to break down, or it has to break down first before the worms can eat it. So I can see a little look there.
Of the Jedi thing, everything goes in that.
So even your meat and your dairy, and you're not worried about the rats coming up?
I have dug it in, so the rats don't get it.
So that would be the only way you'd stop that, but most people won't do that because that's a lot of work. They just stick it on the ground, they throw everything in, and if all you're filling it up with all your green and brown garden waste, which I find those like base systems and the Jedi system a little bit of work, because if you don't get that green and brown carbon nitrogen ratio right, your pile can become either really hard and dry or really wet and sloppy. Now that doesn't happen to everybody, but it can happen to some people, and so you've got to keep them dry, wet, but not really wet, and they can't be too dry. So there's lots of things that you've got to do to manage those systems, unless of course you just throw it in there, walk away and leave it and don't do anything to it and let it just rot down on its own. And that tends to be what I do. I've got 10 bays in my backyard that I do tests on. And so as long as if you do it like that, you don't have to ever touch it. But what happens is all that goodness is going straight down into the ground below it. And you might have a metre high full of waste, and 2 years later you'll have about this much full of waste. So it's taken an enormous amount of waste to create this little tiny bit of soil at the bottom. But that's all right, it's great for your garden and whatever, it just takes a long time. What I'm going to show you is actually a way to compost all your kitchen waste. Now this isn't necessarily to take over what you're doing now, but it's a great complement to what you're doing. And if any of you have failed at composting, this is a great system for those people. So all you do with this, and this doesn't work, we all know what worms do. We all know what they eat, what they don't eat, all of that sort of stuff. In the last few years, Gardening Australia have been talking about the little bug that makes my composter work so well, and I'm sure you've heard of him now, and if none of you know about it, but I'll explain it. The soldier fly. Have you ever heard of the soldier fly? And it has, Arno has. Any of you heard about it? So a lot of you might find these in your worm farm or in your bay composters, but pardon me, what happens is they tend to, if it gets too hot in there, they can't function. So you'll find them around the outsides of your bay composter or your Jedi composter. In your worm farm, they can take over your worm farm and get rid of your worms. One of the big issues in a worm farm is that they can't really get out and multiply properly, but that's not such a big issue. It's more that the leachate that they produce from eating your waste is actually ammonia, and that ammonia above ground can be really stinky. So unless you're flushing that system out all the time and flushing that ammonia out all the time, it can be a bit of a stinky thing to have in your backyard as an urban gardener. If you're out in the bush, or on a farm, doesn't matter how bad it smells, who cares out there. But I find most people out in the bush just throw their rubbish out in the bush anyway and just let all the animals get at it. But for urban gardeners, you want a way to get rid of your waste. And putting it in, say, the Jedi, like yourself, you put everything in. That's very unusual. Most people won't attempt that. So this allows you to put everything in your waste, in your compost. And all you have to do is you dig a little hole in the ground, you put your pot in the ground level with the ground so it's hidden in the garden. So it's not taking up a lot of space like the Jedis and everything else. And I'm not saying they're not good, okay? This is just a different way of doing it. And then all you do is fill it with all your kitchen waste. So literally every single thing that comes out of your kitchen, and that is meat, dairy, citrus, onions, oil, paper towel you wipe the fry pan out with, coffee, tea, everything. The only things that I know we haven't put in here is sea urchin and sea cucumber, because I don't know anybody that eats them. Hendrika might know someone because she puts oysters in there and crabs and all kinds of things. So literally everything can go in there. There's ways of, the soldier fly won't necessarily eat those hard shells, but I'll tell you about that in a minute. So then all you do is lock the lid on this way or this way. Now if you lock it on this way, you can mow over it. So it doesn't have to go in a garden bed. You can put it beside a big tree. And then you can mow right up the edge of the tree, but you're nourishing that tree with all your own waste. Now what that soldier fly actually does, well, let me go back one step. Ideally then cover it with something. Now I love my grass clippings and leaves because they're free and they're plentiful in my garden. If you haven't got grass clippings and leaves, you can use straw, hay. If you've got lots of leaves, scrunch them up. Put the lid up this way, scrunch it up, cover it up. You can't see it in the garden. Nicely hidden. And anything but ideally sugarcane mulch. Now that's not to say you can't use sugarcane mulch as a cover, but if you've got a rat problem in your neighbourhood, I don't recommend sugarcane mulch, because in the tests that I've done, and I do these tests in confined spaces, I can smell the sweet smell of molasses coming off the sugarcane mulch. Now you can't smell that out in the garden, but the rats can. And I had one customer tell me that she'd never ever had a rat in her garden until she put sugarcane mulch on her garden. And I've got a very good customer who also has had the same experience as me with covering his pots with sugarcane mulch. It's the only time I've ever had rats try and dig around and get into my pots. And I know that from customers too, that call me up and say, oh, rats eating through my pot. Why? Because they've covered it with sugarcane mulch. And the other thing they haven't done is they haven't soaked their scraps. So the trick that makes this work is soaking your scraps. Now, if you fill this with just worm-friendly waste only, you can do that, but worm-friendly waste only attracts critters. It attracts bush turkeys and possums and everything else, because everything in your garden is looking for something to eat. That's not to say it won't work with worm-friendly food. It all depends on your circumstances. But if you've got a rat problem, you must soak your scraps. So what you do, you just get I've got 2 containers that I keep in my kitchen, and one on top of the other. And all you do is just toss everything in there. You don't have to chop anything up like you often have to do with worms. Just toss it all in and add any wastewater that you're throwing down your drain. So not good water, and that's, you don't want to be using good water, particularly if you're on water restrictions. So any water you're throwing down the drain is what I call wastewater. It could be cooking water, it could be a container you're rinsing out to go in your recycle bin. What else? It could be dishwashing water if you wash up by hand. Anything you're throwing down the drain. The scary part is when you start saving that water, you realise just how much water you're wasting down the drain. Because all of a sudden your containers will be full of water before they're full of scraps. But that's okay. You have to work out what works for you. As a general rule, if your scraps are covered in water, they won't smell for 3 to 5 days, but some things go off quicker than others, like cat food goes off overnight. It's stinky, stinky stuff. And sometimes meat will go off quicker than other things. So you have to work out what works for you. But the longer it can sit in that water, the better it will work inside your pot for several reasons. One is it starts a decomposition process. It softens everything, so you can literally fit 10 litres of waste in there. It looks like it only takes 5 litres, but you can squash 10 litres of waste in there. 2 is that fermentation smell, so it'll get stinky in your pot, and that's why I say you've got to work out what works for you. That stinky smell, that fermentation smell is what keeps the bush turkeys away, the rats away, the little antechinus and things like that. But the soldier flies love it. So when you cover that with your grass clippings, if you haven't got soldier flies in your pot within a week, and I'm literally saying within a week, all you've got to do is uncover one of those little holes so that the odour gets out on the air. It's not an odour that you'll smell, but they will, and they lay their larvae in the surroundings that you've covered on top. They find their way in, and within a week, your waste will have dropped down to here within a week. If you were just to fill this with fruit and veg, if you're a vegetarian, it'll literally be empty in a week, 2 weeks when you get those soldier flies in here. That's how fast they are. Now worms are fast, but they're not that fast. If you put everything else in here, like your meat, your dairy, your citrus, your onions, oil, and as I say, I put everything in here. Even takeaway, I meant to bring my waste this week, even takeaway containers, that are those cardboard containers. And when they're soaking in the water, it makes it easier for the bugs and all the other little garden critters that you get in there to break all the waste down. So as a general rule, it'll take 4 to 6 weeks for that waste to break down. But the difference with this system, say as with a worm farm, you just keep topping it up. You don't have to wait for everything to decompose, you just keep topping it up. And ideally, you plant them around the garden and you just rotate filling them. And eventually you'll nourish your whole garden. The worms will live outside the pots. They won't come in there while the soldier flies are inside your pots. And they will move around the garden. They'll spread all their castings around the garden. And the soldier flies do all the hard work with your waste on the inside. But the leachate that they produce is actually ammonia, which is what's created from an anaerobic environment. And ammonia is hydrogen and nitrogen, which is exactly what your plants need to feed. So every time you've got your container with all your waste and all your water in there and you tip that into your pot, all that water flushes all those nutrients into the soil and it's instant food for your plants. And in fact, this is if you look at that, this is Aspley State School where Hendrika's kids go to school. And you'll see the massive difference. Like it feeds roughly a metre around the pot. Now that will spread the longer you leave it in the ground, and it all depends on how good a gardener you are as well. So if you're like me and you don't have time to garden and your garden's super dry, it'll only feed her out this much. But if you're a good gardener and you're keeping that moisture in your garden, the worms will move around the garden. Now as good as the soldier flies are, and as clever as they are, slowly over time the pot will fill up with soil. So when it gets to a point where it's like maybe that far from the top and you think, oh, that probably needs an empty, make sure it's fully decomposed and you will know the difference. The difference in the soil is incredible. And it's actually not soil, it's called Fly Frass. And it's actually richer than worm castings because you have put 10 times more different ingredients in there than you would have put in a worm farm. And that's not to say worm castings aren't good, but if, say, for instance, you left a pot and it all turned to soil, you might only have, say, 1/4 of a pot of soil left in the bottom at some point because you hadn't looked at it for a few weeks and you go back and you find some soil in the bottom. When the soldier flies are all vacated and they find their way out through the soil, they look after themselves, you never have to worry about them, you never have to worry about your worms living or dying either. So when the soldier flies are vacated, the worms will actually move in. And if there's enough nutrients left in that soil, they'll just keep munching away on that soil and producing their castings in there as well. If you actually fill this with just worm-friendly waste, the funny thing about worms is worms want to level out soil. So if you've got raised garden beds, ants and worms keep trying to take that soil back down to ground level, but in the pot they try and do the reverse. They try and fill the pot up with soil. So if you fill this with worm-friendly food only and have it full of worms, you'll find you have to empty it more often, and you need to scoop it out there and spread it around the garden, put all your worms around the garden, and then start filling it again. Now, I don't have time for that. That's why I just put everything in together and I let the worms look after themselves. And that's pretty much it in a nutshell. It does lots of other things if you'd like a little bit more information on, say, sand. Have any of you got clay soil or sandy soil? Clay, have you got how much topsoil have you got on your clay soil? About 100 million. Yeah, really bad. So you can actually improve your clay and sandy soil. Now it's not an overnight fix, but it will absolutely fix your soil. But what you have to do is you have to, I used to tell people to put shredded bamboo on the top, because in the tests that I've done, the worms take the shredded bamboo deep down to the bottom, and the shredded bamboo is a great cover because it allows the water through. Looks beautiful on your garden, by the way. Costs money, unfortunately, but it doesn't mat together like grass clippings, so the water can always get through, and the worms take it deep down to the bottom, and it takes a really long time to break down. So it really improves your clay soil over time or your sandy soil. But what I actually tell people now to save that step and all that hard work for the worms is dig a little bit further below your pot and around your pot, because you need a place for the worms to live. So roughly 3 inches around and 3 inches underneath. In that bottom, put all your twigs and branches and things that take a long time to break down. And you'll probably need to put a little bit of soil in there to fill up the gaps, and then put your pot in on top of it. So that little hole in the bottom gives the water that you're going to tip in there all the time a place to go, and it gives the worms a place to live around this, the clay. And they can't move up or down through clay or sand, but they can move sideways into it. So I've got a customer in Bribey Island, she said it completely transformed her sandy soil. So it's not an overnight fix. I've got another customer in bad clay soil, and she's got one in the garden. And so every few months she just digs it up and moves it another few feet to improve another part of the garden. And it will absolutely transform your soil. But if you've got a really high clay level, like you're saying, you've only got that much soil, you must make sure that you haven't got a really high water table. Otherwise, there's nowhere for your water to run off, and that can create an issue because it will fill up with water and turn into a sump. So in that case, then in that type of garden, in the rainy season, the best thing to do would be to take it out and do it above ground and just have it in the ground in the drier seasons where it's not going to get full of water. So if you want to do it above ground, this is like having 2 in the ground, and it's super, super fast. So you get a nice pot. I tell people to get a pot that's easy to pack stuff around with their hand. This is a bit tiny, but I just take it to the trade shows to make it easy. And what you want to do is put your pot in there so when the lid is on this way, you can still cover it with leaves and it's still hidden in your garden. And then you can be really creative if you want. And, well, there's a creative little design there, my big chook on the top of it. I forgot to bring him tonight. But one of my customers put a little house on there, and I use my little rabbit here as a bit of a decoration, and I had one with a plant on there as well. Too much stuff to bring. So the idea is you can make it look like an ornament in the garden rather than a composter. Now when you do it like this, you want to insulate around the pot. So in the ground, your pot's insulated by the soil. Above ground, you need to insulate it. So that's how I get rid of all my junk mail, all my old bills, cardboard takeaway. If you wet that, you don't need to shred the paper, because if you shred it, it breaks down so fast, you've got to keep packing it up. So I don't bother doing that, I just scrunch it up. And if you wet it, you can literally fit 500 sheets of paper in there. So it takes an enormous amount of paper. But you don't have to wet it straight away. It depends how you want to do it, how lazy you are. So when you've got your container then with all your water and